Andy Johnson. We're looking at the scope and sequence chart for reading, what I sometimes call the scope and nonsense chart. Let's take a look. First of all, what am I talking about? Scope and sequence chart tells what, that's the scope, and the sequence in what order. And we'll take a look at these in just a minute. But this is based on the premise that students are standardized products moving down the conveyor belt, and standardized pieces should be put on these standardized products in designated places and in a prescribed order. This is Humpty Dumpty in thinking that if children would put all these little pieces back together again, that they would somehow be able to read. So teaching reading is breaking down the process of reading into little teeny tiny pieces and helping children put the pieces together again. However, as a wise philosopher once said, all the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't put Humpty together again. This just is not a useful way to think. It's not how the human brain operates or creates meaning. Here's an example of a common scope and sequence chart. Here's another multi-sensory Orton-Gillingham scope and nonsense chart. And again, the idea is you go to level 1, level 2, level 3, step 1, step 2, step 3, blah, 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 blah. Teach those little reading sub-skills, master them, put all the little pieces together, and at the end of the line, bingo, you have a person who can read. This is based not on research, but on I thinkisms. I think this will work. I think this is the way we learn how to read. Now, the Common Core state standards, and I hate to disappoint you here, and I know some people will run screaming from the room, but this is an elaborate scope and sequence chart. Yeah, there are some important and interesting things to be taught here. Standards are good, but this doesn't mean that a whole bunch of standards are better. There are far too many standards in the Common Core state standards to be of any use. It represents Humpty Dumptyan thinking. Now, it is somewhat useful scope and sequence chart. It gives you a sense of where to start. I mean, we generally start when we are teaching letter sounds with the consonants and vowels. However, middle vowel sounds are not that important, so we shouldn't get so whooped up about middle diagraphs and trigraphs and this and that and magic R's. Once upon a time, there lived a beautiful princess. Even though the middle vowels are taken out, we can still create meaning with that. So how important is or are middle vowel sounds? Just something to think about. The scope and sequence chart does give us some indication of letter patterns we can help children begin to notice. And we use inductive teaching strategies, word sorts, and other sorts of things to help children notice words. This is a more powerful form of learning. We'll look at that in just a minute. But these scope and sequence charts, they are just not reliable to be used in a prescriptive fashion. The scope and the sequence, the letter sounds and whatnot. For example, you don't believe me? Letter patterns are just not reliable to be taught in a prescriptive fashion. Do a Google search, words with, and insert one of the letter patterns there. Insert one of those letter patterns into your Google search. And I did this with the OA letter pattern. Now, when you introduce a letter pattern to children, generally, you want to use words that have 5 letters or less so that they can notice the letter pattern. As well, you want to include words that are in students' lexicon when introducing a letter sound or pattern. When I did this with the OA letter pattern, I came up with 27 words that might meet this criterion, and you see them right there. This is not common enough, not consistent enough to waste precious instructional time that could be spent reading good books. As well, do a Google search with words with the long O. Words that make the same sound, but they have a different letter pattern, you'll find a whole bunch of different and other letter patterns. What? Oh, this doesn't make sense. Now, it makes sense for an adult Humpty Dumpty in mind to take all these things and break it into little pieces. Oh, yes. But to a child's mind or a beginning reader's mind that's trying to make sense of all of this, it is a bit confusing. As well, Bruner told us that learning inductively is a much more powerful form of reading than expository teaching or learning passively when someone tells you what is. When you can discover what is, this is more powerful than when one simply tells you what is. However, for the sake of argument, and I know people are going to disagree and say I'm a crazy old bald man, that's okay. Let us assume for the sake of argument that there were thousands upon thousands of OA words, and this was the only letter pattern in the English language to make the long O sound. It would still be of limited value. Because look at those sentences there. We can still create meaning with these. We still know what the word is, even though the very, very, very important OA letter pattern has been eliminated. Okay, what about CVC? These letter patterns that we spend so much time on, that all the scope and sequence charts, including the Common Core State Standards, says is so very, very important. What about those? They are not reliable and not consistent enough to spend a great deal of time there. Again, we can use this to help children notice certain letter patterns, but to teach them in a prescriptive fashion and to test them and to say children are not ready because they don't have these skills, pish posh, that is just silly. So some tips: scope and sequence charts. Of course, use them to give you a sense of what patterns for children to notice, what patterns you ask them to notice. And again, inductive reasoning activity. Use these activities that ask children to notice certain letter patterns, given a bunch of words, put them into groups, word sorts, that sort of thing. And large unit phonics based on letter patterns. Teach letter patterns versus individual letters. This is much more efficient. Lots and lots of authentic reading and writing, and allow children to demonstrate when they're able to notice and recognize or any reading subskill, and then document versus standardized tests along the way. Standardized tests, this, that, and the other thing, looking at individual words out of context. It makes no sense looking at individual words out of context because all words we encounter ever are within the context of either a sign or a sentence of some sort. Scope and nonsense charts, just some general ideas.